Do you remember where you were when Prince died?
I do, actually. I remember exactly where I was when he died because and again, I should probably tie in my wife at this point. My wife is as big of a Prince fan as me, and she was actually in a meeting in San Francisco when I was here actually in my office at my desk. And I was just like, blown away. Like, that can't even actually be the case, right? So she's in the meeting, right? And I text her, like, have you heard this? And it turns out my niece had just texted her, and she didn't believe it either, So, I start searching the internet. Oh, my God, it's real. Prince died, right? And she was supposed to get on a plane after this meeting and go to Minneapolis that night. She was actually in Minneapolis that night where they had the all-night party in the streets to celebrate his death. I remember it very vividly, and it's kind of funny, because when a celebrity dies, even if it's somebody you have a true affinity for, it's like, oh yeah, that really sucks. But it's like, I just know so many people that when Prince died, it actually kind of hit them hard in a strange way, harder than it would in another way, or if it were someone else. And I think it's just because that music just sort of resonated with people and was such a big part of their lives. It's sort of like, I don't know what you would equate it to, like when John Lennon died, right? Even though the Beatles were over by then, the Beatles were really over when John Lennon died, and it hit people really hard. And I think Prince, when he died, certainly hit me the same way, and a lot of others I know.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of Shaping Opinion, we're joined by Robin Teets. He's one of the best branding experts I know, and he's also one of the biggest Prince fans I know, which is important for this episode, because today we're going to be talking about the artist formerly known as Prince. Shaping Opinion is a podcast where we talk about the people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. In this episode, we dig into the challenges Prince may have created for himself when he decided to change his name from a name to a symbol in 1993. Before we set the stage, I know you're a big Prince fan. You even visited Paisley Park once it was open to the public, that is. What was that like for you?
Well, yeah, as you said, always been a huge fan since the time I was 12 years old. And, that music is just sort of like a soundtrack to life. And it still takes me back to this day when I hear it. But yes, I did. We visited Paisley Park. My wife and I she's also a huge fan. I guess it would have been 2 Novembers ago. It was a month after it was actually open to the public. And no, it wasn't November. It was December. And I know this because it was a Thursday morning in December in Minneapolis, where the high for the day was going to be 8 degrees. So, and we had bought these VIP tickets online in advance, right, to walk in and tour the place. And it turns out, because it was so cold, we were the only 2 people. So not only did we get the sort of VIP tour, but we got the personal tour of Paisley Park, which was just kind of an extraordinary experience for a fan. Although, to be honest, to see Prince's house / recording studio / concert venue, it was all of that in one. I don't think you need to be a fan to be kind of blown away by what he created. And, the crazy thing is he designed this thing when he was in his late 20s. It was built by the time he was in his early 30s. And it's just crazy to think that someone that age had the kind of vision that he had to build what he built.
Prince Rogers Nelson, that was actually his name. Prince Rogers Nelson was born on June 7th, 1958, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm going to go through some of the facts, and feel free to jump in whenever it seems right for you.
Sure.
His mother was Mattie Shaw, a jazz singer. His father was John Nelson, a musician, whose name was Prince Rogers on the stage. So Prince's given name was Prince. And as we know about him, and you may already know this, but he had a rough childhood. His parents split up. He lived with his mother and stepfather for a time, but then he ran away from home. And then he was adopted by a family called the Andersons, and he and the Andersons' son, Andre, they became close, and they joined a band called Grand Central. And the band renamed itself Champagne, so that was sort of the first of the renamings. And then when he was 18, he started working on demo tracks, and one of them led to him signing a recording contract with Warner Brothers Records. And he was the youngest producer associated with that label at that time. So his debut album was in 1978, and it was called For You. And now we're heading into territory you may remember, because this is where he started to become very popular. After that, he had a string of hits. Some of them, I'm never good at saying the names of songs like this, but Why You Want to Treat Me So Bad, and I Want to Be Your Lover in 1979. His single, called 1999, took him to new heights. And by new heights, we mean MTV. His other hits included Little Red Corvette and Delirious. And this is where we really get into Prince when we talk about in 1984, he released his album Purple Rain, which is seen as his masterpiece. A little known fact is that his father contributed to that album. That's what I read. What did that album do to you as a fan?
For me, those earlier albums, as I mentioned, 1999 was really the album that engaged me, right? And that was maybe 1992-ish. And you're right. That's what made him. I think Prince made Prince, and Prince always was Prince. That's what made the world pay attention to Prince, and begin to see how much different he actually was than I think so many other artists at the time. But Purple Rain comes out, and you're right, that's an entirely different level. I mean, so here's a guy who had a #1 album and a #1 movie more or less at the same time. People, somebody who may not have been alive or cognizant at the time may not realize that's actually a soundtrack to a movie that is at least loosely semi-autobiographical, right? Mm-hmm. Somewhat based loosely again on his childhood, growing up in Minneapolis, and his relationship in the movie with, I guess, his father, but more his stepfather, right? In real life as well. So you put all that together and you realize this is 1984. He's 24, 25 years old, and he doesn't just write all the music. He produces that album and stars in a corresponding motion picture, which is like a cult favorite to this day. It's kind of extraordinary what a musician he was. But all of that aside, at the time he blew up, right? So that was also around the time of Michael Jackson and Thriller, right? There were no two bigger stars of that moment than Prince and Michael Jackson, and if you throw in Madonna, you've pretty much defined the 80s, haven't you?
You have, and we're talking about branding today, and just when you look at all three of those artists and how they crossed platforms. You mentioned movies and records mm-hmm. and music, and the same thing with Madonna and Michael Jackson in pop culture. They transcended music, but that is where that whole idea of branding came in. It almost defined branding the way we even look at it today across any industry. Because what they discovered then was you didn't have to limit yourself to just one industry or one field or one area of expertise. So in Prince's case, it was music, and then it was movies, and in the larger sense, art. Right after 1984, he signed a new contract with Warner Brothers, actually, in the early 1990s. Mm-hmm. And that's where we start to get into the complicated nature of his identity, his brand. Because Warner Brothers signed this contract with him, and at the time it was the most lucrative music contract in the industry. And Prince wanted to release material as soon as it was ready. But the problem for Warner Brothers was Prince had 500 unreleased songs in his studio vault. So the executives at Warner Brothers said that would saturate the market. It would dilute demand for Prince's music. So they did not allow the release of the music, and that's when Prince rebelled. So since Warner Brothers technically owned and trademarked the Prince name or brand, Prince decided to change the terms of the deal in a creative way. It took time, but Warner Brothers eventually would end its distribution deal with Prince, but that's when it got more complicated. In 1993, that's when Prince announced he would no longer go by the name of Prince, but rather by what he called a love symbol, which was a mashup of gender symbols for man and women. It was an unpronounceable symbol whose meaning has not been identified. That's how Prince described it in a statement at that time. Now, do you remember how you felt at that time in your experience with Prince as a fan when he changed his name?
As a fan, it's interesting because I can look back on it now and I can see the business side of it, and that's an interesting analysis in and of itself. But back then, as a fan, I thought what everyone else did, which was some variation, right, of WTF. That's crazy. No one has ever done that before, right? What does that even mean? And then at the same time, you do realize if anybody would do such a thing, it would be Prince. But it was fascinating. And it did, if you look at it from a business perspective, in some ways, it hurt him a little bit at the time. Music sales, his sales of his music actually were going down. There may have been multiple reasons, for that. At the time, but I don't know if the issue of the symbol and the name change helped or hurt him. I think it was very polarizing for folks. People tended to have an opinion about that symbol, and well, not so much the symbol, but the fact that he changed his name to a symbol. Again, unheard of, but. So, it was a really interesting time. And again, I think I probably, at least as a fan, reacted the way most fans did.
In a business sense, you had lawyers and other people seeing this as genius as well, because what they said was he found a loophole in a way that allowed him to continue to producing art while waiting for his Warner Brother contract to run out. And that wouldn't happen until the year 2000. So the media didn't know what to do. There's a lot of confusion over who came up with this, but it was actually the media that started to call him the artist formerly known as Prince. And they didn't do it so much intentionally as it became the default phrase to describe him, since he was using a symbol to describe himself. But as you mentioned, record sales declined. So the change in his branding really had an immediate impact on him in many ways. But the question, and there is a question, is what effect did it have on him over the long term?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think actually that's where a little bit of hindsight, and you can see. I don't know that he was necessarily. We don't know if he was necessarily trying to create the dynamic that he ultimately created, though knowing the guy, knowing who the person that is Prince, based on everything that we know, it wouldn't surprise me that he tried to create the dynamic. But the reality is, long term, he enhanced his brand, frankly, his legend, because of that move in a couple of ways. Again, from a business standpoint, he helped to change the business. A lot of people forget that, other stars, even in the 90s, right, when this was going on, had issues with their contracts. I think of a guy like George Michael, who I think it was Sony, maybe, where he felt he was creatively shackled, I can't remember the terms that he used at the time, right, by his record contract. And I think it was maybe 3, 4, 5 years he didn't record. He ultimately lost his case. Prince found a different and creative way to make the statement and continue to be able to be the artist that he wanted to be first and foremost. And he took a symbol, a fascinating concept. I mean, it can get lost on folks. Like, think about that, like changing your name. Tim O'Brien is now a symbol. It's just kind of the craziest thing, but he took that and he made it work. He had, the symbol became synonymous with him in time, even when he changed his name back to Prince in the early 2000s after the end of the contract with Warner Brothers. You know, he has guitars, and I saw him at Paisley Park, guitars that are basically the symbol, you know, different colors. It's fascinating stuff. He made that work, at least over the long term, in a way, you know, like I said, that sort of enhanced his legend.
You talk about his guitars. I you know, as a music fan, but also as a football fan, one of the most iconic halftime shows of all time in Super Bowl history was his performance in the rain, ironically, and he had that guitar with that symbol. It was in the shape of that symbol, and that's the image. I actually probably one of the best halftime performances ever. And it wasn't controversial. It was just the talent and his commitment, because I remember the stories about the people behind the show being concerned that somebody would get electrocuted, possibly him, performing in the rain with an electric guitar like that. And yet he decided to go forward with it, and he gave 1,000%. When you watch that, and when you think about that performance and just what it did to Super Bowl history, pop culture history, music history, and then his legend. It's just one of those things, and it goes back to that brand because the image is him with that guitar, with that symbol. Now, there's a story behind the symbol, and I read in the magazine Wired in 2016. They published a more detailed account of how that symbol came about. The love symbol was created in a span of 2 days by a guy by the name of Mitch Monson. And Mitch Monson was a graphic designer, but he said that the design was inspired by Carbon and Electra. So here's how he described it. He said, this is how Wired magazine described it actually. In 1992, Mitch Monson was working at Paisley Park, and they were at the recording compound in Minnesota. The musicians team had hired Mitch Monson's firm, and he was creating graphics for some music videos. So the album that they were working on still did not have a name, but the videos included Seven and My Name is Prince, among others. One day, Prince's head producer approached Monson, said Prince needed a symbol, and his producer did not say why, but Monson and his fellow designers assumed that it would decorate the album cover. But Prince had said through his producer that he wanted the icon to fuse astrologically inspired Mars male and Venus female symbols, and he wanted it soon. So this is when Monson says they worked intensely all night long, sketching ideas, and then Prince came in the morning and selected the design that they use now, called the love symbol, and he linked it with his identity. And after that, they barely altered the drawing. So the way Monson described it is, he said, the design that you see now was almost untouched. We did very little to it after that at all. And he said that he actually got criticized for that afterwards. He said that a lot of people in the design field and marketing field all said to him that the love symbol that he designed was off balance, that it wasn't perfectly circular, and that the right side of the crossbar is misshapen. What Monson said was Prince actually wanted that on purpose, and when Monson tried to clean it up, he said Prince told him that it was supposed to be that way because he didn't want it to be perfect. He said it's like the human body. It's asymmetrical. It's imperfect, and he wants it to be that way. So that was intentional. So what Monson didn't know that was beyond an album cover, that Prince already had larger plans for it, for set designs, album covers, the guitar, and other things. What do you think of the symbol? How does it work for you? Or do you think anyone else could do it that way?
As far as anyone else can do it that way, I'll set that one aside for the moment. What I think of the symbol, I mean, I didn't know what it was. You know, it's interesting. Even when I first saw it, I didn't pick up. Someone had to explain to me. I didn't frankly pick up the male-female symbols converging, although you can clearly see it, right, when someone talks about it. I would say at the time, I mean, it's perfect Prince, right? I've read similar stories. Carmen Electra was his backup dancer. He also was on the verge of getting married, and so he had these women in his life, and he was thinking about this convergence of male and female, and that's what led him to be attracted to that particular design. But, as a fan, then, what are we talking about, 1993, something along those lines, it wasn't focusing, you didn't focus so much on the symbol itself and the meaning of the symbol. You just were like, the guy changed his name to a symbol. He changed his name to a symbol. It's kind of crazy. I mean, in terms of your question, could anyone else get away with this? Could anyone else have pulled this off? No. For me, the thing about this conversation around the symbol and what it meant to his brand and why ultimately it enhanced it, to me, it's because of authenticity. And I think that's true, so you and I are communicators. We're brand people. I think we understand this, that authenticity is critical to a brand under any circumstance. Doesn't matter if you're a business, doesn't matter if you're Prince changing your name to a symbol. It has to feel like it fits. And in some strange way, of course, it had to be Prince that changed his name to a symbol. I can't think of another artist in my lifetime where that would actually make sense on any level. But it does with him because in some strange way, it's authentic to who he was as an artist.
In 2000, after the contract expired, Prince went back to using his old name, which allowed him to innovate in new ways. Prince produced music on his own label. He bundled extensive LPs. He even created concert tickets and made them available through newspapers like Willy Wonka, only using a purple ticket instead of a golden ticket.
Right.
He even became one of the first artists to sell an album online, and he won a Webby Lifetime Achievement Award for his visionary use of the internet to distribute music. That's how they described it. So he was kind of a pioneer or in that sense too.
He saw different means to get his art to people, and that's what he wanted to do. He created all the time. He's got a vault in his basement at Paisley Park, that is just basically chock full of music. He wrote nearly constantly. It's funny, he has a video editing suite in the place as well, and they take you in and they show you sort of his, they'll show you something on the screen. And what they said was they found in this place, and they'll show you, there was a false wall in the recording studio, or in his video editing studio, excuse me. And when they pressed it, they found a door. Eventually, they were able to get the door unlocked, and they found volumes of all of his concert footage that he had taped, and he had kept it all and had cataloged it personally because no one else knew that it was there.
A very detail-oriented guy.
Detail-oriented guy that cared about his art and cared about getting his art to people. Again, that was, in a way, right, that was the essence of his problem originally with Warner Brothers. It led to the symbol. And I think that's what led him to, despite the fact that he may not have had a cell phone or surfed the internet much, led him to be an innovator in that regard as well, because it was ultimately about getting his art into the hands of the people.
Prince died on April 21st, 2016 at Paisley Park in his recording studio complex. At that time, he was 57 years old. So the big question for us when we step back and we put our marketing hat on, our branding hat, the question is, what are the major takeaways or lessons for people in the marketing business? If only Prince could do some of the things he did, what can we learn from him, and what can we apply in our own work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think we'll see another Prince for a while, and I don't think we should, as marketers, hold ourselves to that bar. But that said, I think it goes back to two things that we just talked about, right? Innovation and authenticity. And probably that's the reverse order. I think for a brand to be successful and to be meaningful, particularly over any length of time, it has to feel authentic to the people who are the audience that you're communicating to. And if it doesn't, it's not going to work. So to me, that's the big piece by far in terms of branding. And then the second one is, you can at the same time feel free to be innovative and look at things in new ways, as long as you don't fall outside the realm of what feels authentic.
Robin Teets, Thank you for joining us today. It was a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun here too, Tim. Thanks for having me. And, if you ever want to talk for 5 more hours about Prince, let me know. I'd be happy to do it.
Make sure to check out our show notes for more information on everything that we talked about today. You'll find a complete bio on our guest today, Robin Teets, and you'll get a link to some of the articles we mentioned. You'll also get to listen to other episodes. And don't miss our next episode. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast in many ways, and they're all free and easy to find at shapingopinion.com. This is where we talk about the people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until the next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.